Greetings, everybody. This is Module 3. Wearing a slightly different outfit in a different place. Excited to talk with you a little bit about core concepts of organizing this week. So we're going to try to use some pretty clear examples for some terms that can be a little bit confusing if you haven't worked with them before. Sometimes I get confused as well. So the first thing we're going to talk about today is theory of change. So there's an interesting example here that we're going to actually just let people unpack in the image, but we're going to talk about this term in the broadest sense. So it's an organization or group's idea about how social change happens. So it's basically how you think you're going to be able to achieve the change that your organization or your group is focused on. And people have a lot of different versions and understandings of how that works. This term has become popularized by foundations and philanthropy in the US in the last 10 years, but it's a concept that is not particularly new. All social movements have some kind of driving force behind it. The best way to explain it is to go into some specific examples. So we're going to do that now. So we want to give you an example. Some of the reading is about the pillars, so some of this connects with information in that chapter of the book, and we can talk a little bit more about that. We're going to use a U.S. context frame to understand a little bit about the different parts of work that some people use to connect to their theory of change. So you will probably have watched a little video by Michael Jacoby about advocacy services and organizing. So just for those of you who might not, services are, for example, how you provide services for people directly affected by harm or a variety of negative factors in their life. So there are a lot of services like homeless shelter is an example of a service. A rape crisis center for people who have experienced sexual assault would be an example of service. Advocacy, using the same example, would be who is going to political systems and advocating for people who are homeless or for people who have survived sexual assault. Often in advocacy, the people who are the advocates are not the people who actually need the services. It's very rare, historically a little more common now, but rare that you will have people who are homeless or formerly homeless be the people advocating for themselves. Sometimes an organization takes them as delegates, but it's pretty rare that they're actually the lead advocates. Organizing has to do with people essentially advocating for themselves in larger groups of people. So organizing would say survivors of sexual violence or people who are homeless or formerly homeless organize themselves. Most organizations in the US that I think are most effective are using some kind of combination of the strategies. So for example, there are organizations that use organizing and services where people can go and get direct response to help deal with sexual assault, for example, that they've survived. And they have a way that after they get the services they need, they can become part of organizing. And take action about the issues that have directly affected them. Sometimes an organization even incorporates all three. So in some cases, using the same example, you're getting services for dealing with sexual assault. You're getting moved into the part of the organization that organizes people. For example, maybe you're doing Tuesday night support groups that also write letters or take a particular action or take to the streets for a march. And you also might be moving inside that organization through the advocacy arm, where you're actually taking people to state legislatures or to Washington, D.C., and advocating for the changes in policy that you think would most benefit people who've survived sexual assault. So hopefully that's a really clear example. So we use that because that's a U.S. context. Most theories of change in the U.S. use some kind of language somewhere between all three. I'm a little hesitant to totally say that because the further left of the political spectrum, sometimes it looks a little bit different, which is why we're going to use an international example as well. But most theories of change in the U.S. use some combination of those factors. And we're going to engage a little bit more about how those come together. I would also encourage you, it's a little bit woolly when you Google theory of change. You're going to get a lot of corporate theories of change. But if you have organizations that you like and respect internationally or in the US, Google and see if you can get any information about their theory of change. Some groups make it public and some don't. So if you did that, you could see a whole variety of ways that people approach this question. They're written very differently. Some theories of change are really broad. Some are very, very specific about, we're working on rights for bikers. And so in order to shift traffic patterns, we need to get at these particular policy makers in our local community. Like, they can be very specific or they can be very broad. I also want to layer in an example of an international context frame. So this example is from the MPL, which roughly translates, especially for those of us who do not speak Spanish, as movements of residents in struggle. So I got the chance to learn through Mi Gente and the Not One More campaign that we're going to talk about a little bit more today, some about the work that's happened in Chile with the MPL. So one thing I think is really interesting about learning about them is that in a lot of countries that have been seen as quote unquote in the third world, a majority people of color countries, they've developed whole other infrastructures for movement that have not been as connected to nonprofits and other models that tend to dominate the quote scene in the US. And so I think it's really interesting to look at their frames as well. So I use this one as example because I also think it's a great example of both and, or in this case, an and. So MPL uses a frame for their different parts of their work, of work that they're doing with the state, work they're doing without the state, and work they're doing against the state. So if that's sounding extremely Marxist or like really confusing language, let's just unpack it. So basically what they're saying is it isn't just one of these things. We don't just need to work with the state. So some examples of the work they do with the state are they run their own candidates for city council in the different cities where their organization exists. They have schools for both adults and young people, and they get some state-supported funds to run those schools. They have a division of their work that's a nonprofit, although it doesn't dominate all their work. And so they're actually collaborating with the state and with the government in that part of the work. Without the state, they're also running their own cooperatives. So they have a cooperative of all women bricklayers that are basically working outside the state, quote unquote, in the free market, right? Doing business. It's a business that they have. So of course it's, impacted by the regulations of the government, but it actually is existing inside their own market. And they're also, build a lot of their own cooperatives, housing cooperatives. So while at the same time they have candidates inside the state, there are also examples where they've just taken over buildings and said, this is going to be our new library. And, the federal government can just sue us till we leave, but it's going to take 2 or 3 years for them to get us out. Meanwhile, we can use this for 2 or 3 years. So some, Occupy Wall Street, for example, would be a more domestic US-based example of occupying space. We've also seen Black Lives Matter occupying precincts, like in Minneapolis, for example. But those are sort of without the state, and they're moving into on the spectrum against the state. The most complete examples of against the state that MPL uses, for example, is, banner drops that are illegal, protests that are illegal, blocking traffic. They have a very interesting commentary about the highway shutdowns that have happened in the US. They really don't like that a lot of people in the US, from what they were telling me, do highway shutdowns at the end of the day. They say that you should always shut down highways in the morning because workers are going to work in the morning. So you're costing the corporations, not the people, their free time. At the end of the day, people are tired and they want to go home and they don't want to sit in a shutdown. And so they were like, why in the US do people do shutdowns at night? It was very interesting. But they have a pretty sophisticated direct action arm. So I think if you were to ask them, just learning about them, they would say that their theory of change essentially is, in order to change the entire country and the lives of the people in their communities, and particularly they are coming from, feminist work anti-poverty work, working for, economic justice for the communities, and it's a majority people of color country. And they're also very pro-LGBTQ. They would say, actually, we can't wait until this utopian moment where there's not a state, and we can't rely on them for everything. And we have to provoke them and push them sometimes to get them to do what we need. So hopefully those examples are helpful. I am not an expert on the MPO, but I know some people who are. So if you have specific examples about them, definitely Google them. You could just Google MPL Chile, or engage me on the Facebook thread and tag me if you have questions, as usual, of course. Okay, moving on. All right, let's get real specific with a little example. So I was trying to think about a really clear way to talk about the idea of what a campaign is, strategies are, tactics, actions. These can be very confusing, especially strategy, tactic, action. Oftentimes when I'm planning, I still get confused about which one is which. So here's a very simple example lent to me. A campaign. Your kid wants you to buy them something. So the campaign is, get mom to buy me a bike. Basically, it's a time-limited push for change inside of the family system in this example, right? What's the goal? The kid wants to have a bike. Strategy 1, self-advocacy. You mentioned to mom the health benefits of biking, right? So this is a strategy where you're going directly to the person that can give you what you want. And don't worry, we're going to break down the actual definitions of all of these things, but we thought it'd be easier to give the example first. You are going to the person that can give you what you want, in this case, mom, and you are essentially lobbying that person about how great biking is for you. You can get fresh air, it's good for your health, etc. Right. Strategy 2, power holder advocacy. Have Aunt Bob mention the health benefits of biking to mom or parent, whatever. So in strategy 2, you're going to someone who, some people call this a secondary target in organizing. You're going to someone who influences the person that can give you what you want. Aunt Bob, who holds sway. Mom often talks to Aunt Bob about parenting and what are good choices, etc. So in this case, the kid is going to Aunt Bob in the hopes and possibly with the express ask that Aunt Bob goes to mom on the kid's behalf. Strategy 3, negotiation. Offer to trade the kid's sister or canoe for a bike. Obviously, any of us who have had children know that often we're willing to trade things that are inappropriate, like our kid sister, in order to get something we want. But in this case, obviously, you are saying in a real negotiation, it would be more like something like a canoe for a bike. So basically, you're saying, look, this is something, mom, that I like having the canoe, but I would like having the bike better. So I'm willing to give up the canoe if you will give me the bike. Rounding it out. Tactic. Same campaign. Kids trying to ground the strategy a little bit more. Refuse to eat vegetables until a compromise has been reached. So that's a tactic. When we talk about social movements, for example, a shutdown of a highway is a tactic. A hunger strike is a tactic. Anything that is very specific is a tactic, right? It's sort of the most specific approach. And then an action, in this example, public report to a whole family on affordable bike prices and health benefits, photocopies glued to all living room furniture. So in this case, you take a tactic itself and you make it a specific action. So if what you're doing isn't working, then you're like, that's actually what you do. You take the action and you say, okay, now I'm going to glue this to all the living room furniture. I'm going to let the public know that this is what is happening. In this case, the public is the family, right? Whoever is included in that family. And I'm going to actually just be moving this particular piece of work. So normally, like, for example, some people get confused about a tactic versus an action. Let's take the tactic of slowdowns in union movement, right? So labor movements would have slowdowns where in order to get their wages from, whatever it was, $5 an hour to $10 an hour, you start doing your work more slowly. So you work at a toothpaste factory, there are less tubes of toothpaste going out the door because you've slowed down production, right? That's a tactic. An action could be, we're going to do spring, 3 months of a slowdown. And then we're going to go back to the negotiating table. If it doesn't work, we're going to do another spring of it, right? Or we're going to do, some variation of it in this particular kind of way. So the thing about a tactic, the way I remember the difference between a tactic and an action is the tactic is the approach. It's the method, and you can do it multiple times. The action is that period when you're doing it, whether it's you shut down the highway that particular day, June 12th, 2016, or, you engage in 4 weeks of wheat pasting something down the street on what you're working on. Okay. So we're going to go in a little bit deeper on this. So basically a campaign is a time-limited organizing drive with a concrete demand. So you're trying to get what you want. Beyond just the example of a bike, Fight for 15 is a really clear example of a campaign right now. If people don't know what that is, it's essentially a broad-based campaign to try and get fast food workers to be paid $15 an hour. It involves a strategy of organizing fast food workers. McDonald's is a really good example of that. They've been doing a lot of work there. And it is time limited. It's been functioning for, I think, about approximately 2 years. But it's time limited with a really concrete demand. So the idea is you organize, you agitate people, you use all of the different kind of like strategies you have, tactics, action, and you put everything you've got to a period of time. So in this case, a set of organizations said, we're going to pour a lot of resources into doing this with the effort to see if we can win this specific thing, which is a raise to $15 an hour. And we've seen that some companies have done that already, and some, there's a lot further to go. That would be a very concrete example. Other campaigns, there's so many. You all have watched probably the Not One More Deportation campaign video, which is actually about their launching of the shutdown ICE tactics, the tactic itself, which was shutting down ICE facilities all over the country in order to get media and press through arrests of primarily undocumented people. So they introduced the tactic, and that would be a great example also of the difference between a tactic and an action, right? There were shutdown ICEs in 10 major cities. So there was the Atlanta action, the Seattle action, the Phoenix action, right? But it was all the same tactic. So that campaign also very specific, requesting and pushing President Obama to create an executive order, i.e. take executive action, which he can do as a president of the United States, to end deportations. Now, he did that. That campaign was, quote, won for how it was defined. Of course, it has now been caught in, Supreme Court. There's a whole other layer once you win something. But the goal is to get Obama to do that, and he did do that. That would be a really clear example of a campaign. Other campaigns through time have been a variety of different things, like, the LGBTQ movement during the AIDS crisis in the first wave, getting the AZT cocktail, getting drug prices to be driven down, right? So that was both a push to the federal government. The campaign was, you guys force regulation that brings the prices down, and then to the corporations. And you guys, we're going to shame you until you bring prices down as well. So those would be specific campaigns. ACT UP was working on that campaign, those set of campaigns, really hard, in a 2 or 3 year period, kind of giving it everything we've got. Montgomery bus boycott, of course, is an example as well. Time limited, we're going to boycott the bus for this long till you give us what we want. Again, Googling community organizing campaigns, very helpful. I encourage you to do your own research. There's some really interesting campaign models. One important thing to know about campaigns is that they're always used in organizing, but people have different positions on how important they are. A campaign to change culture that would not be as classically defined as the examples I just gave you, many people also would debate that those are very important. A recent one was over the past several years, there was a move from a set of organizations to get the word illegal stricken from the Associated Press sort of style guide. So the idea was that you get the entire media machine to stop calling undocumented people illegal, to get them, again, going back to negotiation. We'll give you this word undocumented, we'll take the word illegal, and we insist you use this word. So did that win, a concrete sort of demand for one specific group of people? Not necessarily, but many would argue it was also very effective because it was key to giving a different vocabulary to progressives and also people in the middle for how to talk about undocumented people in a more humane way than talking about them as illegals. Strategy, it's a plan to win. It's a conceptualization of how a goal can be achieved. So remember the example with the bike. Trying different strategies. Can we try by advocating for ourselves? Can we lobby power holders? Can we negotiate? What is the strategy going to be overall? Because whatever the strategy is defines what your tactics and actions should be. Because if your strategy is to negotiate with power holders, you don't want to make them really mad when you're moving that particular strategy. You think you can get the goal met. So I think, for example, looking at the Not One More Deportation campaign, if you look at the history of the immigrant rights movement, before Not One More, there was much more of an emphasis, and before some of the work that came around the same time as Not One More, there was much more of an emphasis on providing the idea of good immigrants as people who should be able to get benefits. So pressure on comprehensive immigration reform, a lot of what would be considered more gentle tactics to try to persuade power holders to do comprehensive immigration reform, CIR, right? That wasn't working. It's been a standstill for a very long time in this country, even though we saw peak demonstrations of immigrants in the US in 2004, 5, 6, all in that time. Hundreds and thousands of people in the street, and yet change wasn't accomplished. So when Not One More, which many Unitarian Universalists were very, very involved in, came forth, originally some of the more centrist groups really laughed them out of the room and said, what do you mean we can't stop deportations, you can't do that. We need to keep staying in the middle, keeping friendly with power holders. But as you're probably for sure reading about in the book now, there isn't great proof that cozying up to power holders actually moves them. They often need to be polarized, pushed, provoked into action, and then offered some kind of negotiation. So the strategy really defines your approach. In that case, at a certain phase in the immigrant rights movement, the strategy was to try to humanize and cozy up more and gentle persuasion. So peaceful vigils of thousands of people, humanizing coverage of media, these things were all very critical. Once you move to the phase where people were working to end deportations, you're showing human suffering by having undocumented people chain themselves to gates of detention facilities, to actually say this is the human cost, and we're going to create a political dilemma, a crossroads for policymakers about this. We're going to actually engage this as a public crisis, really similar to what you may have read in the book about Dr. King understanding the civil rights movement, how you engineer a public crisis. So the strategy, usually in a chart, the strategy goes on top of your tactic and your action, because your strategy is going to dictate how gentle or firm or varied or creative, whatever your tactics and actions are. Okay. Tactic is an act that executes a strategy or part of it, often puts pressure, right, on the person who can give you what you want. So tactics can be very controversial to less controversial. Obviously, we've talked a little bit about highway shutdowns. Let's talk about a tactic that's pretty controversial called bird dogging. So bird dogging comes out of labor struggles. Bird dogging, the classic example I use is you work in a factory, you're part of your union, there are no OSHA standards, no safety regulations, and so you lose your left arm in the factory. This actually happens very regularly. People use limbs when working with heavy machinery. So you're trying to get, you're an organizer, and you're trying to get safety standards so that this doesn't happen to anyone else in the factory. And you've asked for meetings, and you've written letters, and, you know, the head of the company won't meet with you. So you just start showing up at his house. And he lives in a really nice house in the suburbs. And you just start showing up at his house, and you call the press, and you stand there, and you say, you know, I'm really glad that you're enjoying your brunch, but my family isn't getting proper compensation for what happened to me, and this could be happening to another worker in your factory. And I'm just going to stand here, and I'm going to follow you around. I'm going to follow you to the bank. I'm going to follow you to church or your place of worship. I'm going to follow you around until you sit down and negotiate with us. So this bird dogging is very much a tactic that tends to bring up a lot of feelings for people, particularly if people see themselves and have empathy for the power holder. So one of the interesting things that often plays out with class is that often people who can identify more with the person in the mansion than with the person in the factory, bird dogging brings up a lot of stuff. And even if that's not the case, it brings up a lot of questions about empathy. I mean, nobody likes to be followed around. But it's also been a very effective tactic for people getting what they want. So tactics can be controversial or not. Again, tactic is different than action, because the action would be a Saturday morning bird dogging outside of the boss's home, right? That would just be just that Saturday. An action is often confused with civil disobedience, because direct action and, oh, we had an action is often used. It doesn't necessarily imply civil disobedience, but it can often involve that. It's basically anything, it's happening in public and it's drawing attention to the cause. That's why it's called an action. There's usually some public or performative aspect to it. So bird dogging, that's an example of that as well. It could also be, you know, teachers who are working in public schools and their students are being defunded, bringing cookies to policymakers to say, you know, hey, we need more funding. Like, you know, we're having a bake sale out here, essentially. So that would be an example of action. And of course, in that case, it's not a very effective action if you don't get media, if you don't get press. If nobody sees that you're doing that, it's not particularly effective. Okay. Getting close to the end. I know there's a lot of terms in here. Components of mobilization. So this is where we get into, and again, the companion reading for this week is giving you more current definitions that we hope will be helpful, because some of this is kind of dense, or it's like, I think I understand what that is, but I need to see it in real time to get it. So mobilization is a gathering of a large group of people to do something to show opponents a collective strength. So when you hear this term, it often is synonymous with an action. The difference is that mobilization implies a lot more people. You can do an action that's effective with 2 or 3 people or 5 people. Mobilization is a show of strength. It's a very bad idea to do it when you don't have numbers, because you actually look weak. You should only mobilize when you actually can get people out there. You can feel the pulse of what's going on in the movement in a particular moment. So March on Washington from the Civil Rights Movement would be a classic example. Immigrant rights mobilization that I mentioned earlier in this module would be a classic example. The organizers knew that the moment was that everyday people would come out. People who weren't in organizations, they weren't in nonprofits. They were in touch with the cause, and they were willing to come out. And so it can be very helpful when you have large numbers. Unfortunately, mobilization doesn't always lead to results. That's why it's relegated much more to a tactic, and then, picked to move into an action for specific dates. as a strategy, it can't usually be the whole piece. The reason why is, like, for example, in New York City, you have a pretty strong, set of progressive groups. They mobilize all the time. And I don't mean that in a negative way. They just do. They have a lot of people condensed into a small geographic space. So they can have actions where they can get a ton more people out there than we could in Phoenix or someone could in South Carolina, right? It doesn't necessarily always produce results. So it's a lot about timing. You'll see in the current definitions, there's a whole piece about assessment, which I think is an important piece that we're going to engage as well in this course as we go along. Another controversial component that's often part of mobilization is agitation. So agitation is the art of challenging someone to be accountable to a community, particularly in their own self-interest. It's sometimes seen as the stirring up of soul necessary to remind us that we need to actively push for change. So this definition of agitation doesn't come from a classic Alinsky model sense of agitation. Agitation is basically, it's a provocative tactic where you are going into, for example, a gay bar. To use that example, it's relevant after the Pulse shooting. And you are reminding people of the connection that they have to each other as LGBT people, and you are agitating them or igniting something inside of them to help them move. Agitation is a really bad idea if you're not connecting it to a tactic and action. You don't want to agitate people just to agitate them, because usually you're agitating them on something that's actually pretty important or necessary to them. You want to make sure there's some action steps. There's something that they're signing. There's something that they're joining. There's something that they're pushing for. But agitation tends to be really important when you're working with marginalized communities, because part of how people survive economically, physically, emotionally, spiritually is by numbing out to some of the daily realities they're living under. And sometimes they need to be reminded, like, wait, we don't have to take this anymore. Why are the cops always outside of the gay bar? Like, why don't they go pick on someone else? Is it just by accident that they're all here outside of the Black LGBT club when it's bar time, and they're nabbing people and arresting people because there's more surveillance here than the white frat bar down the street? Like, what about all those people driving drunk home? Like, that's like a little bit of a mini agitational speech, right? But thinking about how that's utilized in some forms of classic organizing, agitation is used to train organizers. So that's different, and I'm not an expert on that by any means, but essentially that's where you're training people and you're agitating them to sort of help build up their confidence, right? So you're teaching them what it means when someone's critical of them. Like, often when you're training, people who are socialized as women to be organizers, and, they've been living their lives sort of like, maybe speaking very quietly, and that's different across cultural and racial differences as well, or hesitating or putting a question mark at the end of their sentence when it should be a period. An agitational organizer is going to say, why are you hesitating? What are you holding back? What are you saying, Caitlin? Do you not really believe what you're saying? Right? It's actually a very provocative form of training that works well for some people and doesn't for other people. But the idea is to make the organizer stronger in the face of confrontation. Okay, so agitation is critical to getting people mobilized, whether you're doing it in a provocative way that makes people, trying to make people be provoked into an angry response, a sad response, an excited response. It's very hard to mobilize people if you don't agitate them, because they're not going to take 3 hours on a Sunday and march around if they aren't agitated to some degree. Saturation, I also put under mobilization because it's sort of a classic mistake that is a lot wider than mobilization, but is often why, if you plan a mobilization and 5 people show up, it often is connected to saturation. Saturation is when a person or a group of people have become numb to a method or idea because it's being overused. Concepts can also hit saturation in common vernacular, thus rendering them less effective. What does that mean? Well, if you say the same thing to people over and over again, like, we need justice for our communities. So people have been saying that in U.S. politics particularly on the left, since the 60s. Like that phrase, most people are like, okay, well, what does that mean? Like, can we be more specific? It's hit saturation, which means it's not necessarily a rallying cry that's going to bring people out. You can also have a method for mobilization that is hit saturation. So for the majority of people in this country under 40, sending them bulk emails, unless it's a group that they're very personally connected to, not a high response rate. So if you're organizing and you think, oh, I sent, 100,000 emails and, 25% of them were opened. So therefore, I think, we're definitely going to get 10,000 people this March. It doesn't work that way because of the qualities of saturation. The way that I learned organizing, this is very, very much just anecdotally from the Highlander Center, was 30-60-90. So 30-60-90 is the idea. If you send 90 people, and we're talking about people that you somewhat know, that you've actually met before face-to-face, you send 90 people an announcement about that, and then you do follow-up with 60 of those people. You call and say, hey, it's Caitlin, we're going to do this event, et cetera, you'll probably get 30. That's what 30-60-90 is, just to give you a sense. Because a lot of times when people are starting and organizing, they get very demoralized because they're like, well, I sent these emails, and nobody showed up. But, you have to understand what it actually takes to mobilize people, whether it's mobilizing 10 people to come to a meeting in the library or whether it's organizing a massive march. So I think that is the end of our module for today. Hope that it was helpful. Hope the reading is going well, and feel free to get in touch with us on the Facebook page or over our email if you have any questions. Take good care.